Hi, I'm Michael Stittle,
And I'm Nick Nanos.
and welcome to Trendline, a podcast about polling. We release new episodes every other week. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. So, Nick, the trucker convoy protests, or what authorities are calling an occupation now, I think we're at day 19, 20 maybe. You're in Ottawa. What's it like today?
Well, Michael, I was saying before, our office is like a block from the House of Commons, so near Metcalf.
Hmm.
So I go outside. What do I see? Trucks, more trucks, lots of trucks. I see families. I see all of humanity. How's that? Why don't we
Hmm.
say in the trucking convoy occupation protest, all of the above. And like let's face it. Actually, one thing that I can say is that during the week it's kind of like office hours, like 8 to 4. There's
Hmm.
not a lot of not as much activity. There's presence, but not as much activity. It's the weekend that's kind of like party time. Like Friday, people and Saturday morning, people are streaming in downtown. Many of them families with children streaming in downtown to be part of the downtown activities that are led
Hmm.
by the truckers. So more festive on the weekend than during the week. In the week, it's kind of like office hours, and then on the weekend, it's like it's a little more exuberant. Why don't we say?
Exuberant is the key word. Yeah,
Yeah.
I saw some tweets from Ottawa producer Mackenzie Gray. I think he called it one of Ottawa's hottest nightclubs or something that sort of shows up on the weekend. I mean, they had a DJ and everything.
I'd like to say that as someone that is friends and knows Mackenzie, I think there's a little bit of dripping sarcasm in there. And
Yeah,
irony, because that's
that's
also a
yeah,
social commentary on Ottawa as a place.
yeah,
So maybe
right.
Ottawa's not as boring as people thought.
Maybe.
But it's too bad that it's taken the truckers thing
Hmm.
to put a spotlight on the city. That's the
Hmm.
sad part of all of this.
Yeah. Well, we've seen some major shows of force this week, from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to invoking the Emergencies Act for the first time in history, and police crackdowns at the US-Canada border. So we're going to take a look at the political cost to that for the Liberals and Conservatives. For our provincial check-in, we'll see how the premiers are divided on the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And finally, south of the border, a lot of the money supporting the trucker protest seems to be coming from Americans. So, Nick, we'll take a look at the big picture. But first, yeah, back to Parliament Hill. As this drags on, what's the support numbers now for the Liberals and Conservatives?
Well, before the protest, the NDP had a little bit of wind in their sails. They're kind of moving up in the polls. But what's interesting is that in the latest Nanos tracking, we basically have, factoring the margin of error, which is 3.1 percentage points, 19 times out of 20, we have a statistical tie between the Conservatives and the Liberals, 31.1 versus 30.6. Both of those parties are up. And actually, the New Democrats are down 7 points over in the last 4 weeks, that are at around 16.9%. Blocs at around 7, so they're up about 1.
Hmm.
People's Party at 7. That's good for them. They're up about 1.8 percentage points, so good news. And they're numerically ahead of the Green Party. But I guess one way to look at it is there's the two front runners that are tied. There's the NDP that are firmly in third, and then tied after that are the Bloc, the People's Party, and the Green Party of Canada, basically within the margin of error. So looks like Jagmeet Singh was picking up some steam before this protest occupation, and now there's been more focus on both the Conservatives and the Liberals, and both of those parties have seen their numbers move up, but still gripped in a tie between the two front-running parties.
Oh, we've still seen this sort of shift in strategy, though, from the federal Conservatives. I'm curious about that because, I mean, Aaron O'Toole, now the former leader, one could say maybe he made an early exit because of inter-party turmoil over his strategy towards the trucker convoy. Now we've seen interim leader Candice Bergen, who was a very strong supporter, now sort of soften that stance. So what's going on there?
Course correction, Michael. It's a
Mm.
course correction for the Conservatives. The thing is, it's pretty clear that the Conservatives are divided. There are some members of caucus, such as leadership hopeful Pierre Poilievre, that have firmly embraced the protest and all that it represents. And there are others. And why don't we just put Aaron O'Toole in that category, because he's still a member of caucus and an important member of the Conservative Party, who are a little more reticent or cautious. And what we saw at least was Candice Bergen, before she was leader, out for the selfies. I think she did take a couple selfies with some of the individuals in the protest occupation. But now, as the interim leader of the Conservative Party, she has to kind of represent everyone in the caucus, and has had a bit of a course correction where is this, maybe we say 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, might be. Anyways, I don't know. Why don't we call it the Tory 2-step, where they went in one
like
direction.
A good dance move.
Aaron O'Toole tried to take them in one direction. They went back, and now they're back. It looks like very similar to where they were before under Aaron O'Toole. So not cut and dry for the Conservatives right now.
Nick, you mentioned Pierre Poilievre. He's considered to be a front runner in the upcoming Conservative leadership race to permanently, I suppose, replace Aaron O'Toole. He was a really early supporter of the Convoy. Do you think that there's any long-lasting political impact to his chances or overall for the Conservative Party?
Well, he's quite embraced the F word, Michael, right?
The F. Oh, yes.
Freedom.
Yes,
not the other
right.
Freedom,
right.
Michael. I don't know where your mind is going to. We're not talking about some of the slurs that are on flags related to the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. We're talking about freedom.
Right.
And, in his, why don't we call it Blockbuster? Because he had a Blockbuster video, lots of views of his video announcing the launch of his campaign and his vision if he were to be leader of the Conservative Party. Very much focused on freedom, very much aligned with a lot of the sentiment in the truckers' protest. I think he's probably doing that for a number of reasons. It's probably a good way to raise money because this protest occupation has been very good at raising money. They haven't had very much luck getting the money, but they have had luck raising money. So he's probably looking at that as a vehicle to raise money, mobilize support, get organized, and to differentiate himself from the direction that Aaron O'Toole, for example, want to go to. But this can cut both ways, Michael, because we don't know where this is going to end. We don't know whether it'll end well or whether it'll end peacefully, or what will happen in the coming weeks with this protest occupation that's happening in Ottawa. So I think it could cut both ways. It could be an opportunity for him and his leadership. It could be a big risk if this goes sideways and something bad happens and he's seen as being too quick to embrace the protest occupation that's happening in Ottawa.
It's also an assumption here, Nick, that people involved in the trucker convoy movement would even vote for the federal Conservatives. I mean, it is a part of a larger populist movement, which brings us to the People's Party of Canada. So how are they doing now?
Well, like we mentioned when we were talking about the ballot support, they're at around 7% nationally, but there's another measure that's actually quite critical. It's the proportion of Canadians that would consider or be open to voting for the People's Party of Canada. What we've seen historically for this party is that it's usually at around 10% of Canadians that would consider voting for them. Right now, it's at 16%. So what this protest occupation has done is put a spotlight on the People's Party. It hasn't converted a lot of new support, some new support, but not a boatload of new support, or when we say truckload, just to be tongue in cheek, not a truckload of new support, but there's been a material increase in the proportion of Canadians that would consider voting for the People's Party. And I think if you're Maxime Bernier or a People's Party supporter or strategist, you're looking at this and saying the first objective of that party, if they want to pick up more support, is to be on the political menu. What's clear is that over the last number of weeks, an increasing number of Canadians have put them on the political menu as an option. And this is where we're going to have to watch Maxime Bernier and what he does, because I think is he riding his own little convoy?
Oh, I mean, I've been following his Twitter account, and he's really ramped up his rhetoric on there. On maybe if people are watching this on YouTube, we'll show some of those tweets. But he's really kind of going for it, Nick, and to an extreme, I suppose. So I'm curious also with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act, if this is going to sort of further inflame the populist supporters for the People's Party.
Well, the thing is, that's all they have to do is wait it out, because first of all, it is quite something, and that any prime minister would invoke the Emergency Act and the powers that are there. So that is an exceptional situation. And sounds good, always sounds good. Hey, you know what? It sounded good on the first day when Doug Ford said that he was declaring a state of emergency. Mm-hmm. And the next thing that people wait for is, okay, so what does this mean and how is anything different? I'll tell you one thing, the feds introduced the Emergency Act. Nothing's happened downtown. It's exactly the same as it was the day before. And I'll tell you yesterday, and that's all I can speak to is what I see. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, I saw lots of folks bringing gas up to refuel, go past the cops in Ottawa, and bringing gas tanks up to refuel trucks. So, whatever extra powers that the federal government put on the table for law enforcement to use, no change. And, the thing is for the truckers, their protest occupation, they just have to wait it out. And basically, they put a spotlight on the fact that nothing's changed, that there's just been talk, but no real significant action. And I think that's that's really the pain point right now for Canadians that are upset at what they're seeing. There's been lots of talk from politicians at all levels of government. They're introducing all these things that they say that they could do, but specifically for the Ottawa protest occupation, nothing fundamentally has changed yet. So it's going to be interesting to see whether something does change or whether there's some sort of action. But it's pretty quiet right now, at least in the truckers' protest.
Well, there's a real political cost to this. We've seen Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly resign this week, and he's just sort of the latest political casualty in a long list. I suppose we can add Aaron O'Toole to that. Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson is facing a lot of political heat. Am I missing anyone, Nick? It's kind of getting to be a long list.
Well, on our last podcast, we did declare that Aaron O'Toole was the first political casualty, and the ironic twist is that the truckers actually didn't want him to resign. They wanted Justin Trudeau to resign. They want to get rid of him as one of their express objectives in their protest. But what we've seen is now the chief of police of the city of Ottawa as what I'll say officially casualty number 2 this week. And you know what, there will be more political casualties as things happen. And there's no sense on how this is going to end. And as a result, I think it's risky for everyone. And we must say that for Jim Watson is a long-serving mayor of Ottawa, a former provincial cabinet minister, a very successful politician. He's not running for re-election, but I think if he was running for re-election, I'd be a bit worried, but he doesn't have to worry about that right now. He has to focus on his legacy, because I think the last thing Jim Watson would want is to preside as mayor over a very successful period and then to finish off with the perception that he did not do a good job, probably in the biggest crisis in Ottawa, especially at the municipal level, that we've seen in a generation.
Nick, not on that long list or growing list, I should say, political casualties is Ontario Premier Doug Ford. At least not yet. I mean, he's walked a really fine line, between invoking his own, state of emergency and supporting workers, which brings us to our provincial check-in. The premiers are really divided on this. So how is Doug Ford looking so far?
I think Doug Ford managed to walk the appropriate line between kind of inflaming things, but still having a hard line against the what he's called the illegal protest and occupation. Especially, he was, the premier was very concerned about the Ambassador Bridge and also the occupation protest in Ottawa. So, on the one hand, he declared a province-wide state of emergency, beefed up the fines and the potential financial fallout from blocking or occupying critical infrastructure in the province. But then on the other hand, what he did was he also didn't wait to relax some of the restrictions that are at the heart of this particular protest. So, and, he could have been a little more, he could have been, if he had more political pride, he could have kind of delayed things because he wouldn't want to say that he knuckled under to the truckers. But he basically said straight out that he believed that it was the right thing to do, that despite the presence of the protest, these things were going to happen. So on the one hand, he's talked tough and put extra powers into the hands of police to try to settle this. And then on the other hand, he's actually moved forward to relax things. And I think that's that kind of pragmatic approach is probably the best right now, because the last thing that anybody really wants are dogmatic politicians who are worried about saving face. And what we saw from Doug Ford was, I believe, a pragmatic balance. So I don't think he's a political casualty, and he's not on the radar as a political casualty unless something else new happens.
And on the other side of the Emergencies Act support, we've got, a lot of premiers, especially Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, and Quebec Premier Francois Legault.
Yeah, well, for all of them, they basically say that it's not needed and that it's a bit heavy-handed. But, let's face it, Michael, what the federal government did in terms of the Emergency Act was specifically to help Ontario. And Doug Ford is one premier that was open to any extra powers that could help put this protest/occupation to rest and get it under control. So, and it looked like at least that Justin Trudeau was very careful to say that these powers exist, but they won't necessarily be used or need to be used right across the country, that they're fairly targeted. So, and I think code for that was to Doug Ford in Ontario, you have everything that the federal government has at its disposal in terms of legislation and powers to do what public safety officers and experts think need to be done in order to control and put to rest this protest occupation.
Nick, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to look at how much money supporting the U.S. Or the trucker convoy protest is coming from the United States. Nick, so there's reports this week that some of the money raised on crowdfunding sites for the Canadian trucker convoy protest/occupation have come from Americans. And we've also seen former US President Donald Trump really come out swinging against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He even called him a far left lunatic. I think those were the exact words. So what's the big picture here, and how are the Liberal government dealing with this?
I think as someone that follows and watches as an analyst of U.S. politics, for Justin Trudeau, until he gets some kind of derogatory nickname from Donald Trump, which obviously Donald Trump, like he'd have those wrestling type nicknames where he'd kind of diminish his opponents.
Right.
He hasn't come to that point, at least for Justin Trudeau. He's probably trying to think of something clever, but what we're seeing at least is some sort of funding. How much is yet to be determined or known, but some of the funding, and it looks like a noticeable proportion of the funding is coming from the US. And you know what, Michael, this is the sleeper issue to watch. And I think what we're probably going to see, and this could actually turn things on the occupation protest, especially in Ottawa, where if the government discovers that a very significant proportion of the money is actually coming from outside of Canada, that the government, and it'll look like the protest is actually being supported and funded by foreigners, right? And I would expect, and wouldn't be surprised to see the Liberals, if this ends up being the case, trying to recharacterize the protesters as being pawns or controlled or influenced by foreign money. And, you have to remember, Michael, in our Election Act, it's actually against the law for any foreign country actor to fund or be directly involved in elections in our democratic process. And this is probably how the Liberals are hoping to frame this. And especially they've received some flack on using the Emergency Act, right?
Mm-hmm.
From some civil liberties organizations and from a number of premiers. But I think if we end up finding out that, a lot of the money that was intended to support the truckers' protest occupation actually comes from foreign sources, that would be, I would believe, and I'm not an expert, but I would believe, at least from a public debate point of view, a valid reason to invoke the Emergency Act, because it's about foreigners interfering in Canadian democracy. So this is a sleeper issue, and this could be a communications risk for the protest, because it's one thing to have a domestic homegrown movement that is funded by Canadians for a political end. And you know what? That's part of our democracy. It's another thing to have foreigners funding protests in Canada. So follow the money. How about that, Michael? We got to follow the money. And the other thing about this is, who would have thought that Canada would be a world leader in trucking protests? Like, like, congratulations, Canada, for being in the world news and being the first with a really big, major anti-vax trucking protest, because now we're seeing talk about something potentially happening in the United States and in Europe and stuff like that. So, but I'm not sure this is the type of trailblazing that Canadians need, because it's not good for the Canadian brand writ large, especially the disruption at the border. The border disruption, I believe, was a tactical mistake by the trucking protest, because it escalated the importance, it put jobs at risk, and I don't think Canadians really have a major objection to democratic, peaceful protest. But once factories start to close or could close, it's kind of like, that's just too far. So for the truckers, I think it's kind of like cutting off your nose to spite your face, especially since they're reliant on that binational relationship and this good flow of goods across that Ambassador Bridge.
We also had that report at the U.S.-Canada border in southern Alberta of weapons seized in one of the vehicles, which that was right before Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, and that seemed to scare off some of the fellow protesters there. There was, they were there for peaceful reasons, and this sort of took it to a very scary level, which, yeah.
And the thing is that there are also reports of a large shipment transport truck that was stolen that had firearms, and no one knows where that is. And part of the challenge here is that there's information, misinformation, and disinformation. One of the weirdest things that I saw happen was when Mayor of Ottawa, Jim Watson, was engaging with the protest occupiers with the help of the former chief of staff to the Premier of Ontario to try to manage things. And they came to an agreement. There was stuff that was said where, even some of the trucking protesters said, "Oh, that's fake news. That's not real. There's no agreement."
Yeah.
So, part of the problem in kind of for the trucking protest is that the people in the protest might not even believe things that are real related to what the people that are leading the protest are doing, because they're so suspicious of the media and so cynical in terms of the mainstream media also.
One thing I'm curious about, Nick, is we're seeing a lot of American flags and Canadian flags amongst the trucker protesters in Ottawa. They're very proud of this sort of binational movement as they see it. That it's a wider U.S. populist movement that includes Canada and the United States. Do you see a lot of connections there? Do you think that this is part of a bigger movement that will be better organized, I suppose, going forward?
I think this truckers' protest occupation was much more organized than many of the public authorities thought that they were. Like, let's face it, just the logistics of getting the fuel to all these trucks is significant and requires a certain level of organization. And we might make fun of the fact that there's bouncy castles, hot tubs, and bales of hay for kids to jump on. But the reality is that logistically, this truckers' protest is very organized. From a communications point of view, it's very organized and disciplined. And I think the reality is that there is a certain proportion of Canadians that actually support Donald Trump and agree with him on a lot of things. And so it shouldn't really be surprised that not only do they proudly sport the Canadian flag, but they also proudly support or hoist the American flag, because that they know that there are Americans that feel the same way that some Canadians feel about vaccinations and mandates and the restrictions that are in place.
Nick, fascinating stuff as always. I think we should leave it there. Thanks to everyone for listening and watching, and you can find a new episode 2 weeks from now.